Hello, these are flipped notes 7-5, and we're looking at how we experience and express emotions and stress. My Bitmoji is a bit stressed out there. This is a fairly long section, and I want to remind you that you don't need to write every single thing that shows up on the screen. A lot of the stuff in this section is pretty self explanatory, so don't feel like you have to write everything down. All right, experiencing emotion. The person we often associate with emotions is Paul Ekman. He did a large cross-cultural study in which he found that we all view basic facial expressions the same. That even people who've lived in countries or parts of the world where they've not been exposed to TV or other people, and I think he went to New Guinea out in the Pacific, that even they were able to recognize expressions on faces of people they'd never met. So he said that we speak and understand pretty much the same facial language around the world. Ekman identified that the six fundamental emotions are happiness or joy, anger, sadness, surprise, disgust, and fear. We have the ability to make many more facial expressions, but those are the kind of the universal ones. The display rules have more to do with how we expect and how we're expected to express emotions. That has more to do with cultural rules. So, for example, in Asian cultures, they're a lot more, they hide their emotions a lot more, we'll say. So the rules vary from culture to culture. Ekman also looked at micro expressions, or how tiny little movements in our face occur that we're not conscious that we're doing. So, for example, when we're lying, we may be doing things like lifting our eyebrows, and that was Ekman's research. Anger, fear, surprise, sadness, joy, and disgust. The facial feedback hypothesis was an experiment that said that if you hold a facial expression, you'll begin to feel that emotion. So what they did was they would kind of force people's faces into these positions where they were either smiling or frowning, and then the people reported that they did start to feel those emotions after a while. However, this experiment has been recently discredited because different people have tried to replicate the experiment and have not gotten the same results. So that reminds us that in research, the importance of replicating other people's research to see if your hypothesis can be confirmed by others. So, how do we express our emotions? There's two ways. We express emotions unconsciously, and we usually have a fast response to stuff and a slow response in this section. So, our unconscious emotions that we just don't even realize that we're showing, especially on our faces, that can be part of an early defense mechanism. And then our conscious responses. We've had more time to think about it and formulate a response. And a lot of that response comes from our cortex, where we're doing our thinking in our brain. Some of the biological structures that are involved in processing emotions, you'll recall that the limbic system, made up of multiple brain parts, including the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, and the amygdala, play a big role in emotions. The amygdala, we know, is our fear center, fear, anger, rage, and it is continuously on alert looking for threats. The reticular formation, which is down by the brainstem, is the one that sends incoming signals to the brain. So it works with our thalamus and amygdala to look for incoming info, especially if a threat is detected, and helps to kind of get that fight or flight response going. The cerebral cortex, which we know is all of our wrinkly area of our brain, all those association areas that do the higher level thinking, is helping us to process emotions by linking things to memories, feelings. Our right hemisphere seems to specialize more in negative emotions, and the left in more positive emotions. The autonomic nervous system, which is controlled by the hypothalamus, plays a big role in emotion through the fight or flight response. Remember, the fight or flight response is sympathetic nervous system. That's what gets our body all pumped up for action. And the parasympathetic response, which we also call rest or digest, is what calms the body down, but can dominate in more pleasant emotions. Another big factor in the processing of emotions are hormones. A few of them that we'll look at here: serotonin, low levels linked to feelings of depression, but high levels in happiness and love. Epinephrine and norepinephrine, both part of that fight or flight response, produced in fear, more abundant in anger. Cortisol is our stress hormone, testosterone with sexual motivation, and then oxytocin, that's that hugging hormone, the one that you get when you feel good and you have that touch response. Looking at some other emotions or feelings and the hormones involved there, happiness linked to high levels of serotonin, love with serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin, anxiety associated with low levels of dopamine, stress, high levels of norepinephrine and epinephrine, and depression with low levels of dopamine and serotonin. Another theory about primary emotions, Carol Izard, he said that we're more than the six that Paul Ekman identified, and that we can combine these to produce other emotions. In addition to the ones that Ekman had said, Izard added interest and excitement as a basic emotion, contempt, which is like extreme disrespect for somebody or dislike, shame, and guilt as primary emotions. Fear, how do we get that? It's usually learned through conditioning and observation. We associate emotions with specific situations, especially if we've had a bad experience. Observation, by watching others be afraid, then we learn that. And then we know from our last section that fear also seems to have seems to be an innate response. That we're biologically predisposed to learn to fear particular things because they were dangerous to early people and they're still dangerous to us. We know that the amygdala plays that key role in associating emotions with specific situations. What about anger? Where does that come from? Lots of different factors can cause anger, anything from when people hurt you, misdeeds of loved ones, aches and pains, stress. And is it good or bad? Chronic hostility is linked to heart disease, controlled expression of anger. So if you're controlling your anger, that can be good, and it's better than keeping it pent up. However, it can lead a person to talk over the offense rather than ignore it or stew about it, which is actually an okay thing. The catharsis hypothesis believes that releasing aggressive energy can relieve aggressive urges. So, doing something like exercising or just screaming something that's cathartic that gets out that anger might make you feel good. So, research shows that it can be temporarily calming, but it doesn't usually completely get rid of the rage. You've got to be real careful about it because too much of that can cause hostility and it can become more of a habit rather than getting rid of the rage. So, with the catharsis hypothesis, in short, expressing anger can be temporarily calming, it's cathartic, if it doesn't leave you feeling guilty or anxious. So, however, the temporary afterglow, the catharsis usually doesn't get rid of your rage, and more often expressing anger can breed more anger. So, how should we deal with anger? Probably one of the first things is to wait until that physical arousal calms. So, wait till your heart rate has gone down before you try to deal with it, and then expressing grievances in a manner that can promote reconciliation, but mainly waiting till you calm down first. People who are happy, so we're on the opposite end of the spectrum now. Happiness is usually found when we feel the world as safer, we can make decisions easily, we're feeling more cooperative, and we live happier, more satisfied lives. The feel good, do good phenomenon says that we tend to be helpful to others when we're in a good mood. So if you're going to ask somebody for a favor, make sure they're in a good mood first. An example of this, when we think of those Salvation Army bell ringers, they are so friendly and happy and try to say something nice to you and hoping that you'll feel good and you'll do good and give something in return. Daily events generally only cause moods to be altered for that day. So things like retail therapy or doing something else that might make you feel good, it will, but it's only temporary. Even significant bad or negative events, they don't usually destroy happiness permanently, maybe for a little while. But both of those feelings of happiness and sadness are usually temporary. The adaptation level phenomenon says that we tend to judge various stimuli as relative to those we've had previously experienced. So basically, you adapt to your current level of happiness. So let's say you win the lottery, and that's awesome, and you have all of this money, and you have this new great rise in happiness. You will eventually adapt to that, and then you're going to have even more, something new, more significant to kind of create that new surge of happiness. So we just kind of get used to where we are. Our final section in this, or part in this section, is about stress and coping. So, stress is a psychological state that can cause physical illness. Any circumstance that may be real or perceived can threaten your well being. So it doesn't have to be real, it's your interpretation of is it stressful. When severe stress is felt, it can definitely impair our ability to cope with it. The difference between a stressor and stress: a stressor is the stimulus, something, a thing that can cause stress. And then stress is the physical mental change that occurs in response. It's your reaction. Four different components to stress. There's the cognitive appraisal, what you think about it. Do you identify something as stress? Your physiological response, your body's reaction. Does your heart rate go up? Does your stomach kind of feel queasy? Do you sweat? Your subjective feelings, emotions about it. Does it make you sad or scared? And then your behavior, action taken because of the stress. What do you do about it? Stress is not merely a stimulus or response, it's the process by which we appraise it. So we have a stressful event, let's say a tough math test coming up. You can perceive it as a threat, like, oh my gosh, this is beyond me. And then you become stressed to the point of distraction. Or you can perceive it more as a challenge, and I've got to get to work. And then you're more in a state of arousal, like you're focused. When short-lived or taken as a challenge, stressors can actually be good. A lot of people say they work well under stress and they work well under pressure. They'd rather just feel that crunch time and get stuff done then. However, prolonged or threatening stress can be harmful. So it's all in how we appraise the stress and then how long that stress lasts. Some other type of stressors: catastrophic events, life changes and strains, chronic stressors, and daily hassles. Catastrophic events are usually sudden and they're unexpected. They could be potentially life threatening experiences or traumas like home burning down, the loss of a loved one. Life changes or strains: when life circumstances create demands that you have to adjust to, maybe a change in your job, ending of a relationship, or having children. Other stressors, chronic stressors, things that continue over a long period of time, like maybe just some kind of stressors with your job, having a difficult boss or not liking your job. Daily hassles. So these might be little things like traffic or just kind of little annoyances that you have to do every day, but they're not too bad, occasionally, but when you have them over time, all the time, they become a much bigger stressor. So, how do we deal with this? What is our stress response system? Walter Cannon said that our stress response has both a fast and a slow response. Our fast response system we already know about. That's our fight or flight response. That's how our body deals with stress. It sends out a rush of epinephrine and norepinephrine. Those are neurotransmitters and hormones. The adrenal glands release adrenaline and they help to increase the heart rate, mobilizing sugar and fat and dulling pain. So our body's fight or flight response is the fast way. But then we also have the slow response to stress. The hypothalamus and the pituitary gland release hormones through the blood to deal with the stress. Cortisol is the main one, and you definitely want to remember cortisol as our stress hormone. It's secreted through the glucocorticoids. I can't say that word. And that's just the beginning of it. And if stress is longer lasting, then we may be dealing with it through the general adaptation syndrome. And this is a key thing. You definitely want to know this part. Frequently shows up on the AP exam. So the Hans, and I spelled it Hans-Selye, general adaptation syndrome says that we go through 3 phases when coping with stress: alarm, resistance, and exhaustion. And my acronym for this is UR stressed, ARE, alarm, resistance, exhaustion. The first stage is the alarm reaction. And this is usually pretty much that fight or flight response, like, oh my gosh, there's something big that's going on. The example that I usually like to relate to general adaptation syndrome is having to write a giant research paper. When you first find out about the research paper, you go into this alarm reaction. Oh my gosh, I've got to write 20 pages in 2 weeks. I've never done this before. And you kind of go into this fight or flight response. If it lasts for too long, it can wipe you out. But in general, this is just a normal response. Your body kind of gets hyped up and thrown into action. It can cause high blood pressure. It can weaken your immune system. But overall, it's just a normal response. And over here, it shows here normal level of stress resistance. We're a little bit below that at the alarm stage. The next stage is the resistance stage. And this is where you're coping with the stress. So this is where you're kind of in the midst of working on that big research paper. You're doing what you need to do. Outwardly, the body appears to be kind of gaining an advantage. You're resisting to the stressor. You're doing what you need to do. and you're trying to restore homeostasis. Yet your body is still definitely working to cope with the stressor. But this only applies to the original stressor. If something else gets added onto that at the same time, then that can be too much. And then we reach the exhaustion stage. So this is when you're at that due date. You've been fighting this for a long time. You've been working and working. You've been staying up late, working those extra hours, and eventually you reach the exhaustion stage. You're not going to die from a research paper. However, if that stressor is not removed, then you do start to feel some physical effects like headaches, is probably what we would see in this example. But if we were talking about something else much worse, then it could be things like heart attacks and clogged arteries, but a weakened immune system that would make you more susceptible to things like colds and the flu. So, alarm resistance exhaustion. There is definitely a connection between stress and illness. Any stressor can affect your immune system. The human immune response is to deal with short-term stressors, and when we deal with chronic stressors over time, it causes our immune system to break down. Other health related consequences, stress can cause us not to make good, healthy choices when it comes to things like food and rest. Persistent release of cortisol, the stress hormone, can cause long term effects like heart disease, immune suppression, autonomic nervous system effects, hypertension, and headaches. Different personality types tend to cope with stress differently. With a type A personality type, that's where I identify myself. They tend to be very competitive, hard driving. Sometimes they can be pretty aggressive and anger prone pretty easily. They tend to get stressed out very quickly. Whereas type B, they still want to achieve success, but they're a lot more easygoing and relaxed about it along the way. And they tend not to get too anxious or worked up. So, how do we deal with this? How do you cope with the stress? There's two things: reducing stress by actually trying to change the events that cause the stress. So, problem focused coping. If your car keeps breaking down and is causing you stress, then you address the problem by getting a new car. But that doesn't always, it's not always an option. The other option is to change your perception of the event. Respond by attending to your own emotional needs. So, you break up with a boyfriend or girlfriend, causes you stress. So instead, you deal with the emotions. You seek support from family and friends. All right, that's it for Flip Notes 7-5.